Merhaba sevgili dostlar. Guten Abend, sehr geehrte Damen und Herren. Wir freuen uns, heute Sie zu sehen. Es ist wichtig für uns. Ich möchte sagen, vielen Dank, Pilecki-Institut, Gesellschaft betreute Volke und Verein Vice für Ihre Hilfe. Vielen Dank. Und jetzt spreche ich in Ukrainisch, weil heute haben wir viele Gäste von der Ukraine. Доброго дня, шановні пані та панове.
Good afternoon, dear ladies and gentlemen. We are extremely happy to see you today at our event dedicated to the returning of the Crimeans, Crimean Tatars, to their homeland after the genocide of 1944. The topic of returning becomes crucial and actual for our people. Our parents dedicated their whole life, their entire youth, their health for our sake, so that we, their children, live in Crimea and develop our culture. But now we are once again forced to leave our homeland. It is not a rare case. When I speak to elderly people, I frequently hear the question, is it possible that everything that we dedicated our life to was in vain because we have no possibility, we don't have the possibility to live in our homeland? When in Europe, I frequently hear phrases like Crimea is Russia and it must remain in Russia. It is really painful for me to hear this. I don't know why, but the world community doesn't ask our people, the people that during the last 300 years is being under genocide from the Russian state in different forms. It may be Russian Empire, Soviet Union, or the Russian Federation. This photo exhibition is dedicated to the works of Rifhat Yakupov. He is a Tatar, but he found his life in Crimea. He found his family in Crimea, and he was really interested in learning the story of returning of Crimean Tatars to their historical homeland. And he was the one to keep those photographs for the history. He is based in Crimea till present. And ironically, his daughter lives in Odessa. And they live near a military base in the city of Sudak. And they hear the Russian missiles or Russian jets flying to Ukraine. And every time the mother is forced to pray so that those missiles don't hit the house of her children. The times are difficult, and we aim at sensibilizing the people about the problems of the Crimeans and the repressions that our people are facing in the occupied Crimea. And now let me introduce the director of Pilecki-Institut, Madame Hanna Rachiowska. Please, the floor is yours.
Guten Abend, good evening. Thank you very much. I would like, on behalf of Pilecki-Institut, of course, to welcome all of you to this very special event, very special evening. And we meet today on the very also special day because it's European Day of Remembrance for victims of Nazism and Stalinism. And this day commemorates more than 14 million victims of these atrocities committed by Nazi Germany and Soviet Union. And perhaps it's important to recall that on this day, on 23rd of August 1939, Soviet Union and Germany, they made this special pact, Hitler-Stalin Pact. And why I think it's always very important to remember that always these totalitarian regimes, they want to destroy, to erase history, memory, identity, minorities, and in contrary, democratic societies, they try to protect them. And I think well, we know how unfortunately, how often is that people say, especially in Western Europe, that Crimea is part of Russia, let's trade for peace. And it's based on this lack of knowledge, yes? We don't know the history of Crimean Tatars. We don't know the history, how for decades Russia committed atrocities against Crimean Tatars and how they were persecuted. And I'm very grateful that we can today, once again, I mean, we have this occasion to get to know a little bit more about these fascinating people and the culture. And this is probably how we can also, especially also today, fight for this understanding that Crimea is a part of Ukraine, and because understanding this long history, identities, it's like how we democratic societies can really stay on the side of real, true peace. And I would like to express my gratitude to co-organizers of this event, especially Sarah Reinke, Leiterin der Menschenrechtsarbeit der Gesellschaft für bedrohte Völker, Elvis Czolpuch, Crimean Cultural Center, KERMEN, Mayre Pasha, who will sing today. I would like to also recall Rifhat Yakupov, author of these beautiful and moving photos, which are outside, and director of the movie Ernes Sarykhalil. So, and of course, the curator of this program, because this event is a part of our program, Ukraine, Freedom Ukraine, which is curated by Ewa Jakubowska, and we have been running this program since the full-scale invasion, Russian full-scale invasion started. And now I would like also to welcome Deputy Ambassador of Ukraine to Germany, Maxim Yemelyanov, and I would like to ask you for a few words here. Thank you very much.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, today on the eve of the Independence Day of Ukraine that we'll be celebrating tomorrow, we're opening this photo exhibition at the Polish institution in the capital of Germany, Berlin. And this is a combination that indeed inspires and speaks for itself about our friendship and our partnership. Also, today, as you may know, we held the third summit of International Crimean Platform in Kiev. This is already a traditional event where leaders of different countries gathers and direct their attention to Crimea and its occupation. Russia started its war not in February 22. Russia started its war in February 2014. And it all started not in Hostomel or Kherson, not even in Donetsk or Lugansk. It started in Simferopol, it started in Sebastopol. And this war has to be finished where it started, with the occupation of Crimea and its return to Ukraine. Today's summit of Crimean platform had sent two messages. First, that Crimea is not a bargaining chip. It is Ukraine. Second message was that it's up to Ukraine to decide on the path of Crimea's deoccupation. And we're grateful to our partners and allies for sharing this vision. Be it President Zelensky peace formula, be it Crimean platform, all Ukrainian initiatives are primarily focused on human rights, on people's rights. And Crimean platform that was held today is about Crimea's freedom, but it's also about freedom of Crimean Tatars. And we also have to keep in mind all political prisoners, Crimean Tatars, Nariman Jalal, and many others that have to be immediately released, and we will do everything to get them released and get them freed from this Russian regime. Today, just as it was in 1944, Russian propaganda is focused on discriminating Crimean Tatars. Massive deportation then, and everyday repression today. Russian state terror succeeded and developed the worst Soviet practices, and Hanya just mentioned Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of August 23rd, that we also have to keep in mind in the historical context. So what is happening right now? It reopens the wounds Crimean Tatars already experienced in the past, like your grandparents' house, right? And today's exhibition gives us an opportunity to look at life on the peninsula in the 90s. In the period when Crimean Tatars returned to their homeland, and it was a period of hope. So Crimea's return will be also the return of hope to all of us. It will also be a restoration of justice. And in the end of the day, it will be a recovery of the world order. Ukraine's victory is unimaginable without Crimea's liberation. As same Crimea's freedom is unimaginable without the freedom of Crimean Tatars. So Crimea is Ukraine, and we both will win. Many thanks to Pilecki-Institut, our great traditional host, Hanya Mateusz. Thanks, KERMEN, for this initiative. Thank you, Vice Eva Yakubovska, for being co-organizers, if I understood it correctly. Thank you everyone who participated in organizing this event. I wish you a pleasant evening, and Slava Ukraini, Slava Krymskim Tataram. Thank you.
Депортація кримців, кримських татар.
The deportation of the Crimeans, Crimean Tatars back in 1994 is an atrocity which lasts till now. This is a crime which the successor of the criminal regime, Russian Federation, has to be responsible for. Unfortunately, now we cannot succeed in persuading the European states recognize this act as a genocide, which is why it is highly important for us to draw attention to the Crimean issue as much as possible to get it resolved. And now please let me give the floor to the leader of the organization which supports the repressed people, Madame Sarah Reinke. Please, the floor is yours.
I wasn't quite aware that I have to speak in English, but I'll try to switch. Good evening to everybody. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you, Pilecki-Institut, for the opportunity to talk about Crimean Tatars here in Berlin. I'm representing an organization which has been founded in 1968. And only 6 years after that, we published a big documentation about the fate of the Crimean Tatars in the Soviet Union, which was not known in Germany at all. But our little publication was just an echo of the activities of Crimean Tatars in the Soviet Union. Because what impresses me very much about Crimean Tatars is their long history of resilience, resistance, solidarity amongst each other. And this history started sort of right after the deportation. You all know Mustafa Cemilyov as one of the big leaders among the Soviet dissidents. And his name sort of, in his name, everything sort of comes together. His resistance, his fight, peaceful and non-violent fight for the return of his people. And he stands for decades of non-violent resistance, appeals and letters and protest marches and hunger strikes. I think he was the person who worldwide held the longest hunger strike ever. And what were the Crimean Tatars fighting for? The return to Crimea. When we hear the word, when we talk about indigenous peoples, we think about Ecuador or Brazil, but the Crimean Tatars are indigenous peoples. And that means, as I understand, their connection to their land. And that motivates them time and again to return. It was hard to return. We will see that in the movie, and we can see it in the exhibition. But it was also successful. In 2001, 234,400 Crimean Tatars had already returned to Crimea. And we sort of, from the side of our organization, time and again wrote about this and reported. And in 2011, we had the first German Crimean Tatar dialogue here in Berlin. A delegation from Crimea came here, and we organized talks with German politicians, representatives of governments and stuff. And it was so hard to get appointments because nobody knew Crimean Tatars, nobody was interested in Crimean Tatars. And then in 2011, the representatives of Mejlis, for example, they warned. They said, we fear that Russia will annex Crimea, and nobody wanted to listen to them. So for us, of course, it was a shock, but working closely with the Crimean Tatars and standing by their side, we knew their fear. And so when 2014 came, and the chronology of persecution and human rights violations started, it was somehow the first time some of our German politicians really were interested in Crimean Tatars. And I remember that one of our members called and said, why doesn't the German foreign minister have the telephone number of Mustafa Cemiliev and can call him and protect him? So for us, as a human rights organization situated in Germany, we see the responsibility of German and Western European politics for the situation we are in now. Of course, after the full-scale invasion in 2022, the human rights situation deteriorated further. And now the German politicians and also other European politicians, they don't have good access to Russian partners anymore. So we have the feeling that they could have done a lot before 2022 to free, for example, prisoners, but they didn't do anything, and now, they don't really have a lot of possibilities anymore. So it is civil society, Crimean Tatars, Ukrainians, Germans, and of course Poles and others who need to take that into their hands and fight, for example, for the release of our dear political prisoners. The Crimean Tatars have suffered enough. Generation after generation, we have this history of the violation of their rights, but still they are part of a big European society and of the history we share together. And for me, as I said, this history of repression is also a wonderful example for a history of resistance and fight for freedom, fight for return. And I can only say for our human rights organization that we are honored to help or do what we can. And I wish us all a very interesting evening, and I thank very much Elvis for organizing and bringing here to Berlin the exhibition and the film. And I hope you all learn something more today and have a good evening. Thank you very much.
Зараз я розповім
And now,
трошки про
let me tell you a
сьогоднішнього
couple
дня.
of words about the today's plans, about the schedule. Now we are going to watch the movie of the director Ernes Sarykhalil, which is dedicated to the life of the photographer who was the one to document these pictures for us, and about how the destiny of the heroes and heroines of his works changed. And when our people were returning to their homeland, unfortunately, they could not settle down. So this was the time when our leaders made the decision that they won't let the people who already live there go away. But unfortunately, there was no possibility to buy real estate. So people started building their homes on land plots which were absolutely not applicable for living, without any supplies of water, electricity whatsoever. And the medical aid didn't accept the calls from the places where Crimean Tatars reside. And we could think that we already fought our problems, that we will be developing our national autonomy in Ukraine, as part of Ukraine. But unfortunately, now many dozens of Crimeans and Crimean Tatars are imprisoned because of their stance. Those are young people and elderly people. So a little bit further on during the discussion, we're going to touch upon the political prisoners. For example, young girls who were going to Crimea to take care of their parents, and they were imprisoned by the Russians for a long time. And now I would like to ask to perform the national anthem of Crimean Tatars. It is called "I Have Given the Oath." One of the leaders of our nations, wrote this anthem. He was persecuted by the Soviets back in 1980, and his body was thrown away into the Black Sea. But the text that he wrote is still alive. And now it is the anthem of our people. I give the floor to Mary Pasha to perform the anthem.
I çözülmez. Ah şu geceler ne karanlık geceler. Ah şu geceler ne karanlık geceler. Yarılar, yar koynunda geceler. Yarsız kalan ah değil aman yaradını eceller. Yarılan ah yarım aman yar koynunda geceler. Yarsız kalan ah değil aman yaradını eceller. Ural'da dağı yokunun et yağı. Ural'da dağı yokunun et yağı. Bizim Kırım'ın taş toprağı yüreğinin yağı. Bizim Kırım'ın taş toprağı yüreğinin yağı. Yansın da yansın Ural'da dağı, yansın da kül olsun. Yansın da yansın Ural'da dağı, yansın da kül olsun. Kızlı Kırım'dan çıkarganlarının gözleri kör olsun. Kızlı Kırım'dan çıkarganlarının gözleri kör olsun. Kuvanmanızsız yağmurlar Kırım'da tırnağına. Kuvanmanızsız yağmurlar Kırım'da Уралның дағына Біз қайтырмыз сіз кетірсіз Уралның дағына
Друзі, зараз ми переходимо до нашої дискусійної частини. У ролі спікерки Майру Паша, а також Елвіса Чоплух, Чоплух, також спікером. Я просто розгубилася, бо я бачу, що ти теж хотів щось сказати.
Я хотів ще раз представити Майрі і трошки пояснити про ці пісні, що вона заспівала. Ці пісні були написані в період, коли наш народ повертався, був у вигнанні, в депортації. І в цій пісні «Уралдаги» є такі строки. «Біз хайтармыз, сіз кетерсіз, Уралнын дагына». Ми повернемося, а ви підете до Уральських гір. І ця пісня є дуже символічною і сьогодні. І ще я хотів сказати пару слів. До мене під час перерви підійшла одна пані, і я дійсно забув сказати, що також корінними народами Криму є караїми і кримчаки. Це народи, які, на жаль, через імперіалізм багатьох країн зараз знаходяться в дуже важкому і складному становищі. Їх чисельність дуже мала, мова майже не зберіглася, і культура також не зберіглася. Ми маємо знати і про ці народи також. Дуже дякую вам.
Дякую. Тепер запрошую вас зайняти місця спікерів. Ви обирайте свої місця, я також займу. Що залишається? Залишається рідна мова. Писала колись Ганна Аренд, і саме тому в нас зараз дискусія буде і українською мовою. Перед нами стоїть завдання не лише спілкуватися тут, на такій уявній сцені, подіумі.
Discussing something here on this panel, on this podium, but we also would like to involve you into the discussion, so you also will have the opportunity to ask your questions. In fact, when we are speaking about our ancestors in Ukraine, there is always a gap, so the history disappears after some period of time. Material history, immaterial history disappears because of a number of criminal acts and laws of the states that maybe change their names but remain the same. And what is important now, it is not just a wish, it is our claim to pursue this identity. I don't know what German textbooks write about it, but in Ukraine we had this kind of disease when they stated that the culture and the identity were placed as a separate chapter. For example, when you studied Mazepa, you studied the culture of Mazepa time separately, and frequently we forget to include the culture. This is what the Moscow Empire, the Soviet Empire, and the Russian Federation keeps doing as a successor of the Soviet Union, as you rightfully stated. So this is why the act of restoration of your identity, the memorizing act, which we witnessed during the film and at the exhibition, will be the topic of our discussion. So my first question, what was the first story your ancestors told you about your family? So this is a question to both of you, so who would like to be the first one? Well, the genocide of our people started not 1944. It started in 16th century when Russia annexed Crimea for the first time. And when we analyze the history of the ancestry of every Crimean, we will see that this is always a story about a struggle. My ancestors were sent to Siberia by the Tsar Russia. My granddad was sent to Siberia by the Soviet Union, and their children were deported from their homeland to Ural and Siberia. Then they came to Uzbekistan. Generations of our grandfathers had the only wish to return back to their homeland, to the Crimea, and to fight for the opportunity for us to live on their native land. They went to Moscow and Tashkent to join the rallies. They were caught, but they wouldn't give in. And the generations of our fathers could return, and they were fighting for their right to live on their land. And now we are the ones to fight against the criminal regime. And there is a question, how long is it going to last? Is it going to have an end? Will our people actually stop fighting against this regime someday? And we will hope that this battle will be the last one and will end with the victory of a civilized world. Thank you. Well, my question was, yes, this is a question to you. What was the oldest story you heard from your grandmother or grandfather? Unfortunately, I didn't meet any of my grandparents. But still, I would like to tell you a story about the deportation of the family of my grandmother. This is one of thousands of stories, and it triggers me every time. Let me remind you that the deportation happened in 1944. And this was literally a genocide of Crimean Tatars. All Crimean Tatars, almost all indigenous peoples of Crimea were deported, and approximately 40% of them died on their way, and the rest had to fight in the steppe, in the field, for their mere existence. They didn't have anything to eat, they didn't have any homes, and they were surviving the best way they could. My grandmother was 11 when the deportation happened. Ironically, all the men went to the front line to fight. And only her mother stayed at home with her when at night people came to their place to deport them. This was literally a shock, and mother could only cry, and she couldn't do anything. She was shocked. The officer, who was the one to come to their place, told my grandmother, an 11-year-old girl, "Look, you are being deported. You will be traveling somewhere far away. So grab some things, grab some food and water, otherwise you will just die." And my grandmother, on her own, being an 11-year-old girl, was the one to get her family ready for the deportation. So she already knew that she was supposed to take the documents. She took some water, she took some food, she took some warm clothes. And she was smart enough to take dry food items, which was actually life-saving during a long, long journey to Uzbekistan. My family went to Uzbekistan, which was not far away from the city of Samarkand. More than 45% of people traveling to Uzbekistan died because they did have no water, no food, and any sanitary circumstances. But this is only one story which shows the horrible reality and how mean the Soviet Union actually was. And this is how it was generally. When all the men were at the front line, exactly at that time point when only elderly people, women and children stayed at home, the people were supposed to get into the trains, and they were taken from their homeland to some faraway land. When we hear personal stories, well, sometimes when we speak about figures, when we speak about deportations, and the deportation happened within 3 days, and we can imagine the scale of these events. And thank you very much for sharing your personal stories, because the personal stories are getting lost among the figures. Well, and let me remind you that genocide is a crime committed against a group. This was according to a convention on genocide confirmed by Joseph Stalin. Coming back to deportation, and we will touch upon the topic how the Crimeans were trying to return in 1980s, 1990s, and there was already a process in 1960s, but still the intention of Stalin with the ethnic groups, he was about to eliminate any ethnic identity. But when we see that an ethnic group, despite the deportation, was able to keep their identity, their culture, to restore it further on, and jewelry that they wanted to restore, even though many things were eliminated and they couldn't take much of the jewelry that they possessed. So when we speak about material culture of a certain group, we speak about the material culture of the entire world. This is not only a business of the Crimeans or Ukrainians. This is also the business, the matter of the entire humanity. And the humanity wasn't able to save this culture. Still, the Crimeans were able to save their culture after the deportation. Do you know anything from your family stories, how it was able to restore the language, the culture, even though the laws of the Soviet Union were directed to Sovietization and Russification? Well, the issue of the cultural restoration was actually very difficult, and it remains difficult. We must face the truth and realize that it is impossible for a people to keep their own culture without this due support from the state. And the native speakers, they are getting lost generation by generation, and it is a miracle that we could restore at least something which refers to our culture and language. So our main task is the restoration. One of the theses of our people when they were returning to their homeland, because we lost our national autonomy, our possessions and real estates, the main goal of our struggle was not merely returning back to our homeland, but restoration of national autonomy within Ukraine. And those were the high hopes we had, but we lost them after 2014, unfortunately. Let me tell you a little bit about how the culture was kept and practiced during deportation. For sure, most of the people who survived deportation were busy with surviving. And my grandparents who were taken to Uzbekistan were actually lucky because the Uzbeks, thankfully, were very friendly. But not at once. Soviet propaganda was strong enough, and they took care so that Uzbeks saw Crimean Tatars as barbarians who wanted to take their homes and eat their children, and many other horrible things. Well, people listening to propaganda believed it. So they were all scared of us first. But then they would let us into their homes, and then they realized that we were just like them. We spoke similar language, and we sometimes even had similar traditions. So this was the way that first and foremost, people were busy surviving. They were trying to build up their homes and trying to find some jobs. And it was prohibited in Soviet Union to employ Crimean Tatars, and it was really difficult to get Crimean Tatarian children to school, and there were no jobs available. And the family of my grandmother could only survive due to scholarship of my grandmother. It was really tiny, and they could buy one piece of bread every day, and this was what they actually ate during one day. So they shared one loaf of bread. So this is what they could afford on my grandmother's scholarship. And every day when she went to school, she wasn't allowed to cry because she was supposed to be one of the best students. Because if she weren't, she would lose the money and couldn't support her family. For sure, it is really difficult to think about your culture and language. It was also prohibited to speak our language. For sure, the people tried to speak the language at home, and my grandmother could speak the language very well. But it wasn't allowed for the Crimean Tatars to enter the higher education establishments, but they were allowed to study Russian philology. So many Crimean Tatars, as my grandmother, studied Russian language, Russian literature, and Russian philology, and then they could find a job as Russian language teachers. This was for sure really difficult. So this was the way to get them assimilated. But this method failed with my grandmother. And for sure, she has about 300 books with Pushkin, Turgenev, Dostoevsky, and other authors from Russia. Well, classic writers from Russia. And she doesn't possess any books by Crimean Tatarian authors, and no books in Crimean Tatarian language. But her generation secretly could keep the language by speaking it at home. But for sure, the language didn't develop. They could only keep what was already in place, but the language wasn't developing either at schools or at universities or at workplaces. It wasn't in use. As for the culture, for sure there were intellectuals, artists, politicians who tried, risking their own liberty. They tried to fight for a tiny place to restore Crimean Tatarian culture. For example, musicians and dancers created Crimean Tatarian folk groups, folk bands, and they would call for other Crimean Tatars to join. It was really difficult to find them, but they would find, and sometimes the bands which were established in Uzbekistan, they would gather people at least for 1 day per week. But people traveled 100, 200, 300 kilometers to join the performance of these bands because there was no other way to memorize your home, your homeland, your culture. So this was the way people came together, spoke with one another. This was for sure controlled very well, because as we know, it was prohibited to perform some folk music, folk dances, and so on in Soviet Union. So these bands, these folk bands, were supposed to praise the Soviet Union. So this was the way they could survive. Well, this was one of the examples that I would add. Yes, this experience of our ancestors is what we try to use in Germany. We're looking for creative people. We are making creative evenings to popularize our culture and language. Yes, and you can also support KERMEN organization by your donations so they can keep doing what they do and what the previous generation did. It is really important to remember the genocide of 1944, genocide of Soviet Union, and it is really important to know that that in 1917 the Crimeans proclaimed Kurultai their own independent state, which was attacked by the Soviets. And understanding that there is culture and identity after the Koreanization, rootization policy of Soviet Union, which aimed at restoration and support of the peoples of the Soviet Union, everything ended with repressions, which began back in 1928, and there was great terror in 1938. When we speak about 1944, for sure we must memorize this date, but previously the culture, the identity was eliminated as well. The attempt of return didn't start in 1980s. It started earlier. We cannot remember all names, but I would really like you to tell one single story that you remember most of all. So the returning story started earlier, before the collapse of the Soviet Union. One of the brightest stories was the story of Usta Mahmud. This man returned back to Crimea 3 times, and 3 times he and his family got deported and were deprived of the right to stay in their homeland. And for the 4th time, he gave the oath that he would not leave his homeland alive. He poured gasoline on himself and set himself on fire. And he died in several days after, but he didn't regret what he did. He said that he died for the sake of his people, so that his people can return back to their homeland. Let me tell you one story about the attempt to return back before 1980. So can you tell us, or can you share a story? So I wouldn't share a story. I would rather tell you how people in Crimea were welcomed. For sure, after the people were deported from Crimea, Russian people occupied their homes. So those were Soviet people, absolutely Soviet people. So those were absolutely brainwashed people, absolutely brainwashed by Soviet propaganda. And interestingly, these people stayed in Crimea, even though, well, I think this is one of the reasons why Crimean Tatars got deported, because previous genocide were not successful the way the Russian Empire wanted it to work, or wanted them to work. Because Russian Empire would let other people live in Crimea amongst Crimean Tatars to show that this was not the land of Crimean Tatars, but this was allegedly Russian land. So Russian Empire did this way, and they forced Crimean Tatars to speak Russian. And what was this story? So those Russian people learned Crimean Tatar language, and they got assimilated to the Crimean Tatars. This is actually very interesting, and this shows the character of Crimean Tatars. And they were firm enough, they had a stiff upper lip that would let them not to lose their culture, even though Russian Empire aimed at eliminating their culture. Still, it didn't work. So I think Soviet Empire wanted to deport Crimean Tatars, and in a couple of days the whole history of Crimean Peninsula was washed away, and the entire spirit was eliminated. I'm deeply struck by the fact that the people who arrived to the homes of Crimean Tatars, when I was a child, I thought they didn't realize what they were doing, but now I understand they did realize, even though they didn't have any internet and any access to the information. Still, I think they realized that they were arriving and staying in someone else's homes. They gathered things of the deported people, they threw it away, they burned it, and wanted to live their happy lives there. And I'm deeply confused about the fact that those people were carrying their Soviet spirit generation by generation. They would raise their children and grandchildren to the Soviet spirit. I could sense it as a child. I was born in Crimea, and I was sent to a school where grandchildren of those people studied. And I could sense it, even though it was time of independent Ukraine, and at least we had radio and television. So we would consume not only propaganda, but still people consciously chose to consume Soviet information. They would absolutely neglect the return of Crimean tatars. They would give us names, call us names, and they would tell us that they were the masters on this land, and we could even hear it listening to conversations of children. And there was another thing in their conversations. Now I understand what it was. People who came after the Crimean Tatars were deported. They realized everything, what they did and how they did it. And moreover, they passed it to their children and grandchildren, because we know many stories how back in 2014, when Russia occupied the Crimean Peninsula, those children and grandchildren started, so they were happy. For Russia, they were happy because those Tatars would get deported, and they were happy that they could occupy even more houses of deported Crimean Tatars. For example, 2 Russian ladies had a quarrel and even a fight about because of the home of a Crimean Tatar, a neighbor, when this neighbor would get deported. So then I realized that this was a conscious decision of those people. They realized it very well, and so did their children and grandchildren. So I was deeply shocked by this fact. 1991, the second Kurultai, the restoration of independence, took place. Until 2014, those high hopes of Crimean Tatars were to see. Elvis, could you tell us a couple of words about the protests? You already mentioned that it was prohibited to return back to the homes of those who got deported. So they chose the way of pacifist protest. So they decided not to take back their homes, but to build new homes. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? Yes, as far as I know, we don't have much time, so I try to keep it brief. After the indigenous people came back to Crimea, our leaders made the decision by no means to suppress the people who occupied the homes of our grandfathers. Still, the government wouldn't give the Crimean Tatars land plots to build new homes. So they decided to self-proclaim those land plots. So they would build homes without any water or gas supplies. By their own hand, they would build new homes which the government would destroy once and once again. But the people wouldn't give up. They would restore their homes again and again. So this is how the protests happened, and the rights of our people on their homeland were not restored. Unfortunately, even the ambulance didn't react to calls from those spaces where Crimean Tatars would live, so people died of diseases, so they decided to establish their own ambulance. doctors, Crimean Tatar doctors, would help people with health issues. On February 26, 27, 2014, another occupation of Crimea started by the empire with a new name, Russian Federation. I didn't notice it in the film, but you told me that the director of the film, Ukrainian Kremlin, who made this film about two sons, one of them is dying, and the father comes to pick him and bring his dead body to Crimea. So what you made me see is that the previous generation tried to get their children be born in Crimea, but the next generation tries to at least bury their children in the Crimea. So these generation conflict for your parents' generation, the return was the most important part. You now are in Berlin. So what is going to be the future? Well, as for the future and as for the elderly people, when we speak to the elderly people, every time they ask us the same question: was it all in vain what we did? We dreamed of building homes for you in the Crimea, for you to live there. But now our youth is forced to leave their homeland. We don't have the opportunity to live on our homeland. Yes, I also had a conversation with a friend of mine, a Ukrainian lady. She told a story about her Ukrainian relatives who lived in Crimea after the occupation. So they left Crimea after the occupation of 2014. They went to Ukraine because they could not bear to live in occupation. They couldn't bear to live in Russia because they felt like betrayers, as they would have betrayed their own people. So she asked me the question, did you have this feeling to have betrayed your own people? Well, our people is a people for itself, and we have one single truth. We only see one thing as betrayal, namely leaving Crimea would mean betray your own people. And those who didn't leave Crimea after 2014, they are victims to me, as if they would victimize themselves. And despite all the difficulties, they would stay in Crimea so that they don't lose the achievements of previous generations. Unfortunately, as for those who left Crimea, I never called them betrayers because I was also the one to leave Crimea at one point in time. But those people left because of their personal reasons. They could barely live in Russia with the regime. They could not adapt. They had hard time staying silent and not expressing their opinion. And as we all know, it is prohibited in Russia to express your own opinion. So those people who couldn't bear it, who couldn't stand it, who couldn't force themselves to stand it, they left. So what I told my friend, many Crimean Tatars see those who left Crimea back in 2014, they see them as betrayers, because they didn't appreciate the achievements of previous generations. They didn't force themselves, and they didn't pay their price, didn't pay the price of their own comfort. They wouldn't stay in Crimea. So this is the difference between Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars. So my Ukrainian friend was really surprised. It was logical to her, it made sense, but she didn't realize this was this way. So I was also a little bit shocked by the fact that those positions were different. Now let me cite in English before we start with the Q&A session. There was a theater performance, Crimea 5 a.m., because it doesn't only mean living in totalitarian regime, it means that this regime traces you all the time. So let me name a couple of names. There are more of them. Artem Chikos.
Of the Majlis, he was arrested for organizing, in the quotation, and participation in the mass riots after the protests on February 26, 2014, sentenced to 8 years in the penal colony. Rifhat Ametov, a driver and Crimean Tatar activist, he was abduced by unidentified people in camouflage after a one-man protest against the occupation of Crimea in Sevastopol in 2014. Within weeks, his body was found in the woods with traces of torture. Ilmi Umerov, a Crimean Tatar politician, was arrested for violation of, in quotation, of Russia's territorial integrity. He had to receive compulsory treatment in a psychiatric clinic in Simferopol in October 2016. He was released and transferred to Ukraine. Ervin Ibrahimov, a member of the Majlis, was kidnapped by unidentified people in the uniform of the Russian police in 2016, not found to date. Nariman Jalal, a journalist and the first deputy chairman of the Majlis, was arrested in 2021 for allegedly organizing and carrying out a sabotage on August 23. A gas pipeline was blown up in one of the villages of the peninsula. Jalal was in Kyiv on the day of the explosion. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison. І багато інших затримань. Ти говорив також про
Yes, and there were many other victims. So in the beginning of our discussion, you spoke of girls who wanted to visit their grandparents, and they were sentenced to 20 years of prison. But the choice to fight for your culture. Before we start with the Q&A, please, could you tell us shortly about the current events? What does Russia do in Crimea with the architectural monuments? Unfortunately, a hybrid genocide of Crimeans is happening on the territories occupied by Russia. The pseudo-restoration of the palace in Bakhchisarai is also taking place. The old surface of the roof coverage of the palace, the original coverage was changed, and new Spanish one was put in place, a new Spanish quadrille. I don't know why they do that. And in the city of Khatmijit, in Simferopol, a multi-story house is being built instead of an ancient palace. And the natural park is now getting ready for a propaganda festival, Tavrida. So this will be the venue for the festival. Ecocide, genocide happening in front of our very eyes, and we cannot fight it. Yes, we can fight it. We all can fight it. We are strong when we stay together. And the Crimeans are good evidence for this, how they can keep and restore their culture and identity. And this all depends on all of us. Because, well, the year 2022 was possible only because the attention to the Crimea back in 2014 was insufficient. The same thing happened about Georgian occupation, the occupation on Moldova, and 2 Chechenian wars. Now we have the fourth, we have the power, and now we have some time for the Q&A session. So you're welcome to ask your question. Please raise your hand so I can see you. Well, first of all, let me thank you for your stories about Crimea, for your personal story, and thank you for sharing the story about the differences between Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars. I have a question which is connected to the history on the one hand, and on the other hand to the communication with foreigners. Well, speaking to foreigners here in Germany and in other countries, I frequently hear the question, so people don't realize it till the end, why Crimea cannot be abandoned, I don't know, or given away, I don't know how to put it, given away to Russia. So they say that Crimea was occupied by Russian Empire for many centuries, and people have hard time understanding why Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars aim to have autonomy for Kremli and other indigenous people. And this autonomy has to be within Ukraine. Me, as a Ukrainian who lived during independence of Ukraine, I think we lack information about the joint history of Crimean Tatars and other Crimean peoples with Ukrainians. So we have hard times in finding arguments for Kremlin and autonomy within Ukraine. So I would be interested in hearing your opinion, your Kremlin opinion. So my question is about the argumentation, how we are supposed to explain it, outwards, why Crimea has joint history with Ukraine, and why would Kremlin and other indigenous people want to have autonomy in Ukraine. As for our current situation in Ukraine and Europe, it is not a surprise because the information about Crimea could only be gotten from Russian sources. So we are supposed to speak about indigenous people of Crimea, about Kremlin, about Crimeans. I also heard opinions like this. And the narrative about Crimea being a Russian land is really deeply rooted. And when we speak about the Crimea within the context of the indigenous people, this can be the argument, and this can change opinions, because the determination of Crimea is an issue which the Crimeans are responsible for. Well, let me add, unfortunately, we could not choose for the geography of Crimea, and we have two empires as neighbors, Russian Empire and Turkish Empire. Both of them were always dreaming about Crimea. They would want to occupy Crimea, and they occupied Crimea. So for us, Crimean Tatars, the opportunity we had back in 20th century to build our autonomy in Ukraine. We were very lucky. This was not Russia and not Turkey. It was Ukraine. And seeing Crimea now as part of a different state, it is just ridiculous. And speaking of independent Crimea is ridiculous as well. I am fearful, very much. For sure, I dream about the collapse of Russian Empire, but still I am afraid of Turkey. Turkey, that this land, this country can make use of Russia's weakness and attack Crimea. And this is my nightmare. I really want our future to be connected to Ukraine, to a democratic European state, and not with a totalitarian or authoritarian empire, no matter if Russia or Turkey. I don't know if this was a sufficient answer to your question. Yeah, I would like to add there is another story connecting us, Kozaki. So this was a name for Kyrmli, Kazakh, Cossacks, so Cossacks from Crimea. Next question, please. Дякую за дискусію. Я хотіла би додати, якби ззовні, із кінця 90-х ми багато писали українській владі, українській державі, і ми повторювали вимоги кримських татар, тому що повернення було непростим. І мені здається, що українці прийняли кримських татар, вони їх прийняли тільки тоді, коли побачили, що вони боролися на Майдані разом з ними, і вони ідентифікували їх як частину України. І мені здається, зараз ситуація змінилася, однак мені здалося, що тільки в 2014-му дійсно люди в Києві, в інших українських містах зацікавилися кримськими татарами. Ясна річ, що є ця спільна історія. Але нам в Німеччині треба інформувати німецьку публіку, однак і в Україні є над чим попрацювати. Ну, це так зовні, коментар. Yes, sure enough. We in Ukraine also have these kind of issues. Unfortunately, Ukrainian society is not really sensibilized as for the Crimeans, and only starting with 2014 they started getting Crimean Tatars, getting acquainted with Crimean Tatars. Now the situation is much better, and because of Russian propaganda, which poisoned the consciousness of many people, the attitude to Crimean Tatars was well, not really trustful. So Ukrainians wouldn't trust Crimean Tatars because they saw them as invaders in Crimean land. I think that the steps that are being made now are very much useful. As a matter of fact, Maidan played a great role when Ukrainian and Crimean Tatars realized that they have one vision of future, European values. This was the first step towards one another. And now we are getting closer and closer with every year, and I'm really happy to see this. Okay, one more question, please. Thanks a lot. I'd like to thank you very much because, well, I live in Berlin for 15 years, but I cannot remember having any event dedicated to Crimean Tatar history and culture. I would like to remind us of another aspect. This is the connection between Crimean Tatars and Ukrainians. Those are dissidents. Vyacheslav Chernovil, Mustafa Jamilov, they were in camps together, in Soviet camps together. And later, they were the ones who brought Soviet Union to collapse. They were people of high moral values. And we must use them as role models, I suppose. And I think this is a white spot because in Germany, very few people know something about those people. People know about Sakharov, but who knows about Soviet Ukrainian and Soviet Crimean Tatar and dissidents? So there's some work to do here, I think. Thank you. Would you like to reflect on this? Oh, no. Well, I agree fully. Any questions?
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Дякую дуже. Це, скоріш, коментар, а не запитання. Так, я дуже погоджуюся з попередньою ораторкою. Я чув щось про кримських татар, але як німець, насправді я абсолютно не розумію, про що йдеться. І я так бачу, що ситуація складна. І що нам потрібно? Нам потрібно видавати для німців і взагалі західного суспільства дуже чіткі меседжі, як попередньо було зауважено. Я постійно говорю з моїми німецькими співгромадянами, чи Крим належить до Росії. І насправді базисом можуть бути європейські цінності. У нас в неділю пройде фестиваль «Мотанка». Я вас запрошую взяти участь в конференції як частина цього заходу. І йдеться теж про мову. Українці, кримські татари обрали нас, якби, Європу. Вони хочуть в Європи. Ви вже є Європа. І нам треба повчитися чогось. У вас така багата культура, яка через пропаганду і імперіалізм була прихована. Ми її не знали. Мені дуже сподобалося те, що сказав пан Ємельянов, заступник посла, що війна почалася в Криму і вона має там завершитися. І якщо ми, німці і люди Заходу, це зрозуміємо, я сподіваюся, що всі дискусії про перемовини просто зникнуть. Вони просто стихнуть успішним чином. Дякую дуже. Так, і Пілецькому інституту також хочу подякувати. Так, єдина проблема, що ця група дуже маленька. Yes, let me also thank you for your interest. I would like to really thank you for being interested in the issues of Crimean Tatars and the issues of Crimea. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot for the fruitful discussion, and thank you for placing the discussion within these walls. Being a political scientist, I also state the fact that the issue of Crimean Tatars is really a white spot. I think that Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars united during the Orange Revolution. Maybe you don't remember it. Yes, I remember. Well, I think that even political representation of Crimean Tatars was already present in Verkhovna Rada. But my question is of a different nature. If we were to speak about the victory and restoration of Ukraine within the borders of 1991, I think that the role of young educated Crimean Tatars in the development of education and restoration per se. We realized that the Crimean campaign will not be easy from the military point of view. We realized that you would also play a role. Well, there are surveys which are popular in Germany. How many Ukrainians are going to come back to their homeland, to Ukraine, after the victory? So, how do you see the people who would want to return back to Crimea? Are they betrayers? Are they traitors? Well, after the deoccupation, we would have the task to reintegrate and restoration of our relationships, because in 9 years we have some difficulties in understanding one another. I am a medical doctor, and being a medical doctor, I have trouble trusting what people say when they are taking part in the surveys. This also reflects what Ukrainian refugees say about their plans to return. This all depends on how long they stay in European countries. The longer they stay, and the more resources they invest into their lives in European countries, the smaller the probability of their return to Ukraine. Once upon a time, I had a project where I stated that elderly people would tend to want to come back to Ukraine, not the youth. And I think this is the perspective that is realistic for us. This is why we must make sure that people don't stay too long in Europe, outside their country. Yes, as a matter of fact, another careful thing is the lack of skillful people. Yes, maybe it is a little bit early to speak about the occupation, but this is my number one dream, so I can't help but think about it. But still, as Elvis already said, young people, me for example, I went to Europe and I was not at all conscious of what I was doing during my first 6 months, but now I realize what I'm doing. I would like to get educated in Europe. I would like to see all the structures, all the institutions. I would like to soak in democracy and not let in all the opportunities. Would be just not smart enough, not intelligent enough. I would just see how it works in Europe. I would make this experience to take it back to Crimea after the occupation and realize it in Crimea. So this is my dream. Even though I understand if the occupation happens now, and I am a student at an educational establishment here in Europe, I will not return straight away. I would like to finish my studies and take as much as I can from European mentality, culture, and democracy. I would like to try getting a job here to see how job relations function, how they work. And abandoning it all would not be the right thing to do, I suppose. So my dream is for sure to come back to Crimea, and I will come back to Crimea. But if the occupation happens today, the question is how long I would stay here. So I ask myself this question, and surely if Germany allows me, and if I am a good girl, I would stay here for a couple of more years, and then I will take it all back to Crimea. But the question is skillful people who will be working in Crimea if I stay here for another couple of years. And this is what scares me. If I am smart enough and if I would like to study in Europe, maybe I'm not alone. Maybe there are more people who would like to study in Europe. And what would I do in Crimea with this education, with this background? So this is the question. So I think that we must be ready and we must find one another around the globe, and we must create initiative groups, teams who would be working for our future and flourishing country and autonomy. Okay, we have 1 minute for the last short question. So no questions? Yes, there is a question. Well, I have a language question. Knowing how many ruination and linguicides Ukrainian language experienced, it hurts me to see what happens to the indigenous peoples of Crimea. So a question is, what can we as Ukrainians do for your language, to restore your language? Because anyways, we're going to live within one country, and your ancestors learned Russian anyways because they had to. Next generations learned Ukrainian language because they lived in Crimea, which was part of Ukraine. Okay, so my question is, what can we as Ukrainians do to help you resolve your language issue? Well, the resolution of this issue has to do with the restoration of national autonomy in Crimea, and then establishment of paper work in 2 languages, Crimean Tatars and Ukrainians. This would result in a need to have people who can speak and write Crimean Tatar language. Because lately we were working on proposals, but nobody wanted to use it. We would offer people many language courses and we would publish books in our language, but no one would use these proposals because people didn't realize they would really need it. So our joint task with Ukraine would introduce Crimean Tatar language as the second language is in Crimea. Well, I have many things to add, but all the ideas and plans have been already thought about. But this shall happen after Crimean deoccupation. What I can add is just that Kiev supports us and our language. Institutions, research institutions for researching of Crimean Tatar language are being established. And they try adding Crimean Tatar language into the Google Translate, which is a great thing, because me, as the one who barely speaks my native language, my mother tongue, so I speak it really on a basic level, so I'm trying to learn it from scratch. Still, I dream of being able to speak this language on a higher level. I believe it is possible. Sure, when in Crimea, in the future, when I come back to Crimea, I would like to speak Crimean language so that my children study this language. Well, those wishes are similar to the wishes of Ukrainians, so that they are getting served, for example, in a grocery in their mother tongue, or in some office, some governmental office. But this is a long way. And what we can do now is just supporting those initiatives, maybe creating new ones. I know that there are sites for people who are interested in Crimean Tatar language. So if you would like to do that, I can share contacts of my friends. And they start from scratch, from zero. And this language is not similar to Ukrainian at all. This is a Turk language. It is not easy, but still I have a couple of friends who would want to challenge themselves with learning this language. But still, there is great support and great help. I believe it will all be okay, because our situation is not as bad as the situation of Karaims. I follow a Karaim. I personally don't know any Karaim. I only followed a person on Instagram when I realized he was a Karaim. So if you don't understand what I'm talking about, Karaims are also an indigenous peoples, and in Ukraine there are not more than 3,000 Karaims, and there are few of them in Crimea. And this young man answers the question of his mother tongue, how he sees the future of his mother tongue. He replies, long ago I realized I have no illusions that our language disappeared completely, and it will not be restored. It is painful for me to hear things like these. I believe that Crimean Tatar language has better chances because there are more Crimean Tatars. But I'm afraid that if things don't take the path that we want them to take, if the Crimea will not be deoccupied in the next future, I'm afraid that we will share the destiny of Karaims. But now, let me tell you that Karaim language is similar to Crimean Tatar. So it was a promise I gave to myself that I would also learn Karaim language. Well, most of the vocabulary is similar to both languages, so it is extremely painful for me to hear things like these. When I heard it, I realized what Ukrainians feel when I tell them about the situation of our language, because I understand that people who had similar experiences, they know what we feel. Most importantly, we must prevent this situation. This is the most important idea. Well, let me tell you that our situation is not much better than the situation of Karaims. In Crimea, we are not more than 10 to 15% of the population of Crimea, and there are no people who are native speakers of Crimean Tatars. They are bilingual. So the situation with the Crimean Tatarian language is a catastrophe, and this language for sure needs restoration efforts. So we shall not wait for deoccupation. We shall introduce laws in Ukraine to stimulate the language of the indigenous peoples of Crimea. Okay, if you would like to join these efforts, You can also ask questions about the ways you can learn Crimean Tatars. Okay, before we come to before we wrap up, let me tell you that it is really symbolic that this event is running simultaneously parallel to Crimean platform. We didn't plan it. Well, I remember Timothy Snyder in his book, his latest book, he stated the invasion date of Crimea 24th of February. So these dates, 24th, is an anniversary of many things. And tomorrow we are going to have an anniversary of Ukrainian independence, our joint independence. And when we think about this date, we don't perceive it as a festive date. When we see generations giving up their lives for the independence, when we think about the dissidents, for those who would restore the national governments back in 1918, before the Bolsheviks occupied Crimea and Ukraine. So all of the generations who did it under really bad circumstances, well, with bad geography, as you said, all of these generations giving up their lives for the better future. And every new generation has to do the work from scratch. Our generation faces the same challenge. So we want the next generation not to share our destiny. So when we speak about August 24th, we speak first and foremost about the price of independence and reminding the countries who have the privilege of not having joint borders with imperialistic regimes. Well, imperialistic regimes do not respect the borders. If they don't respect the borders of one country, they will not respect the borders of other countries. And then when Ukraine asks for jets and Tauruses, Germany in particular, Ukraine doesn't plead for weapons. Ukraine pleads for the possibility to defend this generation and next generation, so that next generations is not forced to have these problems with culture, because Russia destroys palaces in Crimea, not because it lacks of knowledge and not because it doesn't know it shells theaters and museums, for example, Museum of Maria Primachenko. It's not because of the lack of knowledge. If we don't stop Russia now, it wouldn't stop. This is why we call for you to join us for our big demonstration in Independence Day rally, and let us think of the fact that we must fight for our freedom, and dictators never give freedom as a present. This is what we witness and what we experience. Let's stand together for the freedom. And please join our performance to commemorate more than 500 children who were victims of Russian aggression. Please make sure to bring a mirror to show a hole, to commemorate the ones who will never return, and for what dreams previous generations stood for and what we must remember. This is what kept our identity previously and what helps us keep this generation for the future. This heritage is also the heritage of the whole world. This diversity belongs to the world, and the world must protect it. And let me remind you that you have the opportunity to donate to KERMEN, which is on guard of the identity. Support them, please, and thank them for this event. And we will meet our singer Mayra Pasha tomorrow during the rally, and Elvis Chulpuch, curator, organizer of this particular event, and maybe you would like to make an ending remark. Yes, let me thank you all for coming. Thank you all for helping us. Pilecki-Institut, Vice and Gesellschaft für betreute Völker, and other organizations who care and who support us in these very difficult times. Thank you very much.